All right. Joining in here. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Very excited. We have a interesting, actually, this is going to be a very informative update. I'm going to keep the initial legislative piece very brief. So let's go ahead and we'll jump right in. Welcome, everyone, to the REIA Now update for January 2024. We're going to start off with a couple of things. First of all, we want to say thank you, not only to our sponsors, we want to thank you. Thank you for participating. Thank you for being involved. It is critical. Membership is, it's the heartbeat. That's what we do. So we thank you for being here. We thank you for being involved. And we do want to thank our sponsor, which is Home Depot and Home Depot Pro. And thank you for the discounts. If you haven't used them, you are really missing out. Make sure you are signed up. If you're having problems signing up, talk to your local director, whoever's in charge at your local REIA. And if not, we always have Karen who can help smooth things over, make sure it goes well, because we love our partner Home Depot and we want to definitely continue working with them and make sure everybody is plugged into the program and the discounts available. So with that, we're going to continue on here. At National REIA, we are here to promote, protect, and educate. I'm not going to read this for you, but we do have entrepreneurs across the country who are plugged in and really building wealth. And when I'm asked about, what does REIA do? One of the things I talk about is we put a team together, and we really want to be here and be part of that team and be here to support you. To that end, today, we are going to bring you some information to help build that team out. If you are not sure where a REIA is, if you're not sure how to get plugged into that team, I encourage you to go to National REIA's website, nationalrea.org. You'll find your local REIA right there. You can click on it. And folks, this is how you get plugged in and get into your local team and build. This is how you keep your finger on the pulse of what's going on in your community. So I do want to mention to you, just a disclaimer, I'm not an attorney. I play one on the radio and television regularly, but I'm not an attorney. We are not giving either legal advice or fiscal advice. Please, for your own select specific issues and concerns, please make sure you are checking your own attorneys, your own CPAs, your own consultants. This is for information only, and I think you're going to be tickled with the information we have here today. So with that, we talk about our speakers a little bit. Speaker being myself and Dr. Kuehl. You'll find that Chris is, if you remember, he was on previously and just was very well received with just a volume of information. So I'm going to jump into real quick on the legislative side. There is I should say, we're going into an election year. Okay. The reality is we're in an election year. We've been in an election year for probably about the last 4 months. It's like Christmas keeps coming earlier each year. Well, same thing here. I don't know if you guys have seen Valentine's stuff is already out, by the way. Marketing keeps shifting it forward. Well, the campaigns are doing the same thing. So what that means is a couple things. One, we're going to see a legislative slowdown. Now, mind you, that not much has been happening in one sense on the legislative front because of split control of the House and Senate, and then executive branch. So that has slowed things down. This is going to be a slow process, but something I want to raise your kind of awareness to, and we're going to unpack this a little more in some of the information we provide out, is there is a growing trend, and we talked about this a little bit kind of coming into last year, and it is the quote unquote, people are familiar with big oil, big pharma, big whatever, and it's the way that here's the corporate group that's getting involved. And big housing is really the kind of the newest target. It is an effort that the legislators, and it's on both sides of the aisle, are looking at this issue. You've got equity groups that are purchasing and buying 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 homes. They're buying portfolios of homes. And let's face it, they are not always being corporates, the best in the sense of being housing providers. They are not local. And that is one of the first red flags for a lot of municipalities, who then call out to their elected officials and say, hey, we've got a problem here. We've got some big housing is buying in this area and causing problems. So we want to make sure that we are staying in touch on this. And the point I want to bring to you is this: while this theme develops, it's developing at the national level. There's new legislation that's being introduced. Make sure, all the more reason, that you are plugged in, and you're plugged in with your local REIA, to be plugged in at the local level with your municipalities, your state level, your representatives, your senators, your aldermen, council members. They need to know that you're the local folks, so that when they bring legislation in that's going to be a hammer, they're working with you as a stakeholder, and you're not lumped in with quote unquote big housing. So I just encourage you to make sure you're plugged in on that and go from there. So with that, I'm going to move us into our main speaker. If you have not participated and joined Armada, which is a monthly, or no, they were monthly, it's about a twice a week update that's provided. You've seen Chris as one of our authors in some of our different articles that we provide. He and his partner provide just really in-depth economic issues that are actually, and this is what I really appreciate, written common sense. So thank you, Chris, on that side of it, because you can sum it up and go, oh, that's what that means. And there's times that they'll write it that way and say, here's what this graph actually means. Don't panic, or we got concerns on it. And with that, Chris is actually going to unpack. He's got a number of slides and such here. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Chris Kuehl and his experience. You might have seen him was one of our speakers. You've seen him on one of our other REIA Now calls, and I am tickled to death to have Chris here today. So Chris, welcome to REIA Now.
Very good. Thank you so very much. And we'll talk about those exciting slides. And even with that glowing introduction, I have to remind you, function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable. We are miserable. We ostensibly do. So I'm always a little bit embarrassed when people talk about economists giving good information, because we try, but we're about as reliable as weathermen. And speaking from Kansas City as I am today, I can refer to the reliability of weathermen. That maybe flurry of snow they predicted. Yeah, we got about 7 inches. So we're in the same club. So there's a couple of things I want to talk about just to kind of set the tone, and then I want to open it up as quickly as possible so we can talk about what you're most interested in. Charles has some questions, and I'm sure the rest of you do as well. So first off, just a kind of a level setting, and it's something that we know, but we have a tendency to forget. We are a huge, huge, huge country, and this has all kinds of implications when it comes to economics. Literally every state in the union compares to a country when it comes to GDP. So this ends up skewing statistics. You'll note California. California has the same GDP as Great Britain, which puts it in the top 10 of countries around the world. What that ends up meaning is that you'll get national numbers that include, of course, California. If California is having a good year, it ends up looking like the whole country is having a good year. If California is having a bad year, it looks like the whole country is having a bad year. But in reality, the good people of South Dakota, the good people of Alabama, the good people of New York really don't care what's happening in California. It does not affect their lives, particularly when you're looking at real estate. I mean, the thing that is the most common mantra, location, 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 it's all very local. And so when you have somebody going into hysterics over whatever new statistic has come out, just remember that they're trying to summarize the economy on the planet. If you look at the other economies in the top 5, China, France, Germany, Japan, those together don't equal us. So you've got a country that is dwarfing the other 4 in the top 5. So I've beaten that point to death. Moving on. We're also seeing a lot of migration, and you're certainly seeing it reflected in the real estate market. People are moving out of areas that are high tax and high cost of living, and they're looking for places that are lower tax and lower cost of living. Nothing new about this. People have done this for years, but it's a lot easier now than it used to be. The fact that people can work remotely means that they can live anywhere. They can go where they want to, they can go where the costs are lower, and they can be working for a company that's in a high tax, high cost of living state, but they're not dealing with it. So you can see the exodus coming out of California, coming out of Washington, coming out of Portland. You can see it leaving parts of the Midwest. You can see it leaving parts of the Northeast, moving into the Southeast, the Southwest, and increasingly right up the middle in sort of the Great Plains Midwest corridor. So that has all kinds of implications in terms of where people are going to be looking for housing. Commercial development is going to be there. A lot of what's driving this right up the middle development is transportation. It's the fact two railroads that have merged, one from Canada, one from the US, creating a really powerful north-south rail line that is merging what's happening in Mexico more aggressively with the United States. And we'll get to that here in a minute. But that is driving a lot of logistics, a lot of break bulk facilities, anything to do with transportation moving up and down that corridor. So not to be ridiculously boring, but just quickly on a couple of things in economic theory that matter. One of them is sort of an archaic discussion, but it has implications. What is the neutral rate of the Fed funds rate? It has been assumed for years that it's 1%. Anything over 1% would begin to slow the economy down. Anything under 1% would begin to speed it up. That was the notion that the Fed assumption that 2% inflation was their goal. But now there's conversation about the neutral rate really being closer to 2.5. And if the neutral rate really is 2.5 or 2, that then means the Fed will change its goal. Instead of being 2% inflation, they'll be happy at 3% inflation, which we're almost at now. So it's kind of an argument taking place in the higher levels of economic theory, but it has practical implications. The other thing to be aware of is that central banks are much more concerned about inflation than recession. So if they have a choice as to what to do, they're going to focus on inflation first. And the reality is that recession is not bad for everybody. As a matter of fact, it can be quite profitable. If you are a company that's doing well during a recession, well, gee, you competitors. You can buy upstream, you can buy downstream. You've got opportunities which you didn't have before because other companies aren't doing so well. If you're an individual and you have money during a recession, you're loving it. Everything's on sale. And so you're going to do relatively well. Of the Fortune 100, 65 of them got their start or grew during a recession. So people look at it as the worst thing ever. Central banks don't. Central banks look at inflation and say, no, 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 that's much worse because it destroys the value of people's money, no matter who you are. If you're fixed income, it hurts you really badly. But even if you're high income, you just bought something that cost $30,000 more than it cost 3 years ago, and you didn't get anything different than you got 3 years ago. So your money just lost value. Think about the value of a car right now. The average price of a car is $48,000. 2 years ago, it was $6,000 less. In 2020, it was $10,000 less. So in just 4 years, the car's value has dropped essentially by 10 grand. So it leads to economics as a philosophy. And one of the reasons, Charles and I were laughing about this before started. Put 5 economists in a room, you get 5 different opinions, 6 if one's from Harvard. That's because economics is mostly a philosophy. It is looking at the same data coming to different conclusions, in the interest of self-disclosure and all that. I'm a Milton Friedman economist. I'm a Friedmanite, tend to be on the conservative side of things. And what that means is that I'll look at something, for example, unemployment, and people will say, wow, it's great. Unemployment's really low. It's 3.7. What could be better? Everybody has a job. My attitude is, yeah, not if you're a business owner. It means that the worker has all the leverage. It means that you're paying a lot more than you would have paid before because your employee is saying, I don't care what you do. I can go get a job across the street. I want a raise. I want $20. No, 20, no, 40, no, $70 an hour. And you're like, I can't afford to pay you that. Well, that's your problem, buddy. Guy across the street can, so I'm off. So it depends on your perspective. Not that I want people to be out of work, but there's a balance. And sometimes that balance is what we argue over. And then finally, economics basically is more warning than predictor. As I started this, we're not always great about forecasting. And when you see people doing these long-term forecastings, 2030 recession, 2040 recession, all of that, realistically, they can't see that far in advance. We can't even predict the next Tuesday. But what we're doing is warning you. We're saying, look, if you don't deal with the debt, if you don't deal with worker shortage, if you don't deal with this problem or that problem, you are going to hit a wall in 2030, if not sooner. So it's basically you've got time to deal with this, but you better deal with it. And if we're being realistic, many of these problems we haven't dealt with and we may not dealt with. And that may mean that we have this bad news in 2030, but it's not guaranteed.
Chris,
So commercial real estate, yeah, go ahead, Charles.
before you go, if you go back to that previous slide real quick, it to what degree, and maybe this is something you want to use as a comment as you go through, is thematically, is you mentioned the 1% or 2.5% Fed funds rate, but it seems that we're having something of a national debate on the 2% rate for inflation, or even looking at how much should unemployment be? Is there an ideal spot? And again, it sounds brutal to say that, but we know we're not going to get zero.
Right.
So how much is good? How much is healthy? Is it better to have the fluctuations, or are we going through a kind of a national debate on that?
Yeah, and that's the issue, is that we are having a national debate because it's going to be a matter of what somebody wants or what would be best for their business. You look at something like interest rates. Right now, the investment community has concluded that because inflation is down and it has come down a lot faster than we thought it would, well, then by God, the Fed had better start doing something with that federal funds rate by middle of this year. And so the entire investment community has decided that the Fed is going to start lowering rates maybe as soon as second quarter. Well, the Fed isn't saying that. And the Fed still has a lot of hawks. And the hawks are saying, whoa, 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 I know what you're saying. Inflation has come down, but look at why it's come down. It's come down because of food and fuel. And those are very important factors for the average person. Charles and I were talking about that before this started too. You've got core versus non-core inflation. Economists leave out food and fuel when we're computing inflation because it's almost impossible to compare year over year, quarter over quarter with things that are that volatile, because you end up having to pick a day and say, okay, well, you're comparing the price of gas today to what it was 3 months ago. What day 3 months ago? Given the fact that the per barrel price in the course of a week can vary by 10 or 20 bucks. So we leave it out and say, look, we're not going to even try because it's too volatile. We now refer to that as headline inflation. We're saying, look, that's the real inflation that people are dealing with in their day-to-day lives. But when you try to determine policy from the central bank perspective, they're saying, look, if the reason inflation came down was food and fuel prices came down, we know those can jump back up and jump back up fast. So we're kind of being reserved, saying, yep, you're right, inflation's down. But if something weird happens in the oil market, that $70 a barrel price suddenly becomes a $90 barrel price or a $120 barrel price. And there goes your inflation progress. And so they're saying, yep, we hope that it stays this way and we can lower rates, but don't ask us for a guarantee. And so that's why it becomes difficult to figure out an ideal. You take something like employment, well, you want people working, but then you also want to make sure that you don't have worker shortage or overpaid labor. And this is particularly important in real estate and construction. I mean, the biggest part of the construction budget is labor. And it's one of those sectors that really is not benefiting much from, like manufacturing has moved towards robotics. And it's like, look, if people get too expensive, we're just going to bring in machines. And so if you keep asking for raises, we'll just bring in a robot. Robots can't build homes. Robots can't build commercial. I mean, you can do some of it, and there's more of it than ever, but it's still very labor intensive. And if you don't have enough people to do that work, well, the ones that you do find become really expensive. And then that begins to add to the price of a home, price of a construction project, price of we have commercial construction clients, and they're like, man, to find the people we need, we're bringing them in from all over the country, and then we have to house them on top of paying them. So it gets challenging.
Well,
And we'll
I
you
want to
will
make
get
sure we
this.
touched on that before we got off the
Oh, you
philosophy
bet.
page. So
Absolutely. So, as I started to say, the commercial real estate wall of debt, and you're all very familiar with this. I don't have to go into detail. You're one of the groups I don't. A lot of other people are like, "What? What are you talking about?" And they're like, "Well, yeah, a lot of those projects were begun with very, very low interest rates, and now those are maturing, and it's going to get more expensive. You're seeing projects getting abandoned or delayed. So, again, don't have to beat this one to death. One of the more interesting things that's developed very recently is new home starts are way up again. They were dropping like a stone, and everybody said, well, yeah, that's what we were predicting. But the latest data was showing that, you had an 18% increase of home starts in the middle of winter, which is not generally when this takes place, but it's partly a reaction to mortgage rates. They've come down. They're not low by any stretch, but at one point, not that many months ago, they were close to 9. They were over 9%. Now, under certain circumstances, they're 6.5. So people who were on the fence are jumping in. This is still more multifamily than single family, but even single family is up. The big question, and again, you guys deal with this on a day-to-day basis. So the question has been looming over the sector for decades. What are millennials going to do? What are Gen Z going to do? Are they going to buy homes? Because they have not thus far behaved like boomers. They've not behaved like Gen X. They've not been anxious to get into their own home. They're quite content living in multifamily. 27% of Gen Z males have indicated they do not plan to leave their parents' home until they're in their 30s. So the sound you hear now are screaming parents, coast to coast, kind of going, no. What's interesting is that 27% of the males aren't leaving home, only 9% of the females. The girls are like, I'm out of here. It's like the guys are like, no, mommy makes my food and washes my clothes, and I don't have to do anything except sit in the basement and play video games. Can you tell I'm 70? So anyway, I won't beat that one any further to death. Consumer sentiment is starting to come back up. Now, this is not a indicator that I'm real thrilled with because it's very erratic. You can tell it looks like an EKG. And consumers are notoriously poorly when it comes to this. But in general, we saw a drought when it came to confidence, and it's already coming back up. You've already got people a little less concerned about the coming year than they have been. And not real clear exactly why, because as you pointed out, it's an election year, and this means that everybody running for office is trying to paint a dismal picture, except for you. And it tends to depress consumers. Consumers start to listen to all this and say, "Oh my God, the world's coming to an end. I just heard Congressman so and so claim that Canada is mounting an invasion." And as a result, people get nervous. We have seen PCE come down. This is the preferred way for the Fed to measure inflation because it's more accurate. The challenge is that it is a lagging indicator. It takes 2 or 3 months for this information to percolate in. So the Fed is always about a quarter behind. Right now, they're looking at November numbers, and so we don't really know what inflation was in November or December. The Fed also pays attention to sort of indirect measures, and the most important of those is the U6 unemployment rate. A minute ago, we were talking about what would be an ideal employment. There's 6 different cuts from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The one that you see quoted in the press is U3, because U3 is the first to come out and it's the easiest because all it is are people who are formally on unemployment. But there are people who are not formally on unemployment. They're no longer getting benefits. They're no longer in the system, but they're just as unemployed. That's U6. U6 picks up the discouraged worker, excuse me, and the involuntary part-time. One of the things that has made this tricky of late are the number of people who are doing gig work. We've seen it with Lyft and Uber and DoorDash and all that kind of stuff. It's expanded into all kinds of other areas. These people are hard to count because when we do things like the household survey, the question you ask is there anybody working in the household? And people who are doing Lyft and Uber and DoorDash frequently say, "No, I'm not working." What do you mean you're not working? You had 2,300 rides. I know, but it's not a real job. I don't have a boss. I don't have to call in anywhere. I don't have to tell anybody if I'm not driving. I just don't drive. It's not a real job. It is too. You're getting paid. Well, yeah, kind of, sort of. But it makes it really difficult to figure out who's involuntarily part-time. They are cobbling together a living out of what amounts to gig work. And the Fed pays attention to this because if they see that the unemployment rate is rising, that's when they will decide that they need to start lowering rates. But at the moment, U6 is as low as it has been in decades, and the latest unemployment rate from the U3 perspective was 3.7. So the Fed is still not feeling that urgency. So again, PCE, the latest numbers coming in from September had it around 3. If that neutral rate is actually 2, then we're pretty close to where the Fed would say we're about where we want to be. And now we can start thinking about lowering rates. And I throw this in there just because there are a few of others of you that are graybeards like me. And remember that interest rates used to be much, much, much higher. There seems to have been this collective loss of historical perspective because people look at that period of 0 rates and think that was normal. There are those of you in the audience that remember the 80s and Paul Volcker crushing inflation the best way he knew how. Raise interest rates 20 points. Every company in the country will go out of business. Everybody will get fired. If you get fired, you don't make any money. And if you don't make any money, you can't spend any. And if you can't spend any, nobody can raise their prices. You're welcome. But Paul, honey, that's going to give us 2 years of inflation. Yeah, maybe 5, 10, I don't know, 30. Not my problem. You brought me into control inflation. I did. And those of you in the real estate world remember what a lot of fun those years were. It's like, wow, I got a good mortgage, only 30%. Um, It's just like, yeah, we're not dealing with that right now. We could, but we're not. Delinquency rates certainly having an impact in the housing industry, but right now it's predominantly in credit cards. You've not seen it a whole lot on the housing side. You've not seen it even in car loans. They're beginning to show some stress, but most of what's been in the delinquent category has been credit cards. Bankruptcies are up, both from the standpoint of individuals and businesses. But from people in the credit industry, they're like, well, right now we're getting kind of the predictable bankruptcies, the companies that were headed that way, even if things weren't getting bad. We don't start to worry until we see good companies hitting bankruptcy, because if you have incompetent leadership, well, you're going to go bankrupt even if the entire country is on fire. But now you start to see responsible individuals, well-managed companies beginning to face delinquency, and that's what starts to worry the credit industry as well as banks. Spending expectations have come down from what they were post-pandemic, but they're still above the trend line. If you look over the last 10 years, they're still higher. You can't find a period in the last housing or household spending has got a higher level of expectation. So people are still spending and the consumer is still very active. That's what ended up giving us pretty robust numbers in third quarter and fourth quarter of last year. And that's another reason that economists are terrible forecasters, because we were predicting in Q3 of last year no more than about 1% growth. What we got was 5.2, because the consumers went nuts and they began to spend aggressively coming into the holiday season. So consumers still spending. Business investment has begun to pull back. Consumers haven't. They're still moving and shaking, even at the beginning of the year, which is a traditional time for people to stop spending. Banks are credit tightening. They're becoming a lot more cautious about real estate. They're becoming cautious about industrial loans. They're anticipating a change with the Fed at some point this year. And part of what's happening with a lot of credit now is that companies and individuals are saying, well, if the interest rates start to come down, it will be a better deal. So I better wait. I would like to buy now. I'd like to buy a house now. I'd like to invest now. But if I wait a little bit, well, maybe that cost will come down. So there's a lot of trepidation. I was just giving a talk yesterday to car dealers, and they're doing relatively okay. And they said what we're now hearing are people coming into the dealership saying, I'm going to buy a car, but not till the middle of the summer, because I think interest rates are going to come down by summer, and I think that the cost of my loan will come down with it. So I'm definitely going to buy from you, but not for 6 months. And so the dealers are like, well, that's great, but it doesn't help me much now. And so you're seeing a lot of that kind of behavior where people are anticipating what the Fed is going to do. One of the things that has got us still in a pretty good mood is corporate capital spending is still at record levels and still growing. It's not growing as fast as it was coming out of the pandemic, but those numbers are really high. And it's been motivated by everything from reshoring to robotics adoption, all kinds of things that are driving capital spending. But real estate investment is up there as well. The reshoring thing and the robotics thing is driving a lot of commercial activity. If you're moving back to the United States, well, you've got to go someplace where there's space. If you are adopting new technology and robotics, chances are that your current facility is not adequate. It's not going to be big enough. It's not going to have the right power signature. It's not going to be in the right place. So you're seeing a lot of expansion simply driven by robotics. And you're also seeing people move to different areas. Manufacturers are still driving the highest level of corporate commercial development, and they're doing it because they're sort of being chased out of their current environment. As suburbs have grown around the manufacturer, well, the new suburban residents go, ooh, it's manufacturer. They're loud and noisy and there's traffic. They should move. And so we were here first. You moved around us. Well, that's too bad. We now have a suburb here and we don't want you. So the manufacturers are moving further and further out into rural communities. And the rural areas are excited about them. The suburbs are like, oh, this is a pain. The rural areas are like, ha, you're bringing a tax base, aren't you? You're bringing jobs, aren't you? Come right on in. You can be as noisy and as dirty as you want to be. If it tears up the streets, well, we'll just build new ones. So you're seeing this kind of exodus into the rural areas, and that's partly driven by things like transportation. You mentioned that rail merger up and down the middle of the country. That is driving so much manufacturing expansion because the one thing that manufacturers need is rail access. And if they have good rail access that connects them, and this merger between Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern links the commodity-rich Canada with the manufacturing expansion in Mexico and is just driving activity all up and down that corridor. Supply chain pressures have begun to reappear. Different than the first bunch, we were dealing with things like production. China was behind because of the shutdown and all the rest of it. Now the supply chain is literally because of bottlenecks that are showing up all over the world. We're familiar with Red Sea, Maersk and Costco and all the others are no longer sailing into the Red Sea. It's too dangerous. The Houthi rebels are attacking anything that comes up and down the Red Sea. The Suez is now like 20% of its capacity. Panama Canal is also in trouble because of drought. Normally, you get 35 ships a day coming through the Panama Canal. It's down to 17. There is not enough activity, not enough water in that lake to support more than 17 ships a day. Now you start getting into even weirder circumstances. There are a shortage of certain kinds of ships. There's not enough of the car carrying container ships. So the cars that are coming from Korea, Japan, China, etc., there's not enough carrying capacity. So they can't get them to North America or Europe. So all kinds of supply chain things revolving around transportation more than anything else. Doesn't mean these ships can't move, but now they have to take very long routes, and it adds considerably to the cost of that transportation. Another thing that's become a big factor, and I promise I'm getting to the end of this, we now import more from Mexico than we do from China. And it's not just the stuff we used to import. It's not just oil and food. It is consumer goods. Mexicans are saying, look, we've always been able to make t-shirts and flip-flops and plastic dishes. We can do the same thing China can. We couldn't do it as cheaply as China until now. And now China's more expensive and transportation is a problem. And if you're producing in China and you can't go through the Red Sea and you can't go through the Panama Canal and there's congestion on the West Coast ports, gosh, that's gotten kind of expensive. I'm in Mexico. I put it on a train. It goes across the border, and bingo, it's in the United States. So Mexico is becoming more and more and more an import destination. It's a place that has become critical for automotive, but it's becoming even for other sectors. And next year, one of these two women will be president of Mexico. First time in Mexican history to have a female leader. It is virtually guaranteed because they represent the two largest parties. The woman on the right is Claudia Sheinbaum. She is former mayor of Mexico City. She is a member of the current ruling party. is a scientist by training, is seen as more of a technocrat than her predecessor, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, affectionately known as AMLO. And if she becomes president of Mexico, and she's in the head in the polls right now, she would be the first woman and the first Jewish person to be president of Mexico. The woman on the left is Xochitl Galvez. She represents the PAN party. The PAN is the party of the North. They're the ones that brought us Vicente Fox and Felipe Calderon a few years ago. Their weakness has been that they're very popular in the North, kind of the industrial modern Mexico, but they don't have as much support in the rest of Mexico until now. Xochitl Galvez's father is indigenous Mexican. He's a Mexican. So the southern Mexican population, which is overwhelmingly indigenous, they see her as one of them. So suddenly the PAN has support in the north and the south, and they're starting to close the gap on Morena, which is Claudia Sheinbaum's party. So they're very close on the polls right now. Xochitl Galvez used to be a business consultant. Both of them are more American than their predecessor. So it could be an interesting development as far as Mexican politics is concerned. And with that, I'm going to shut up and take questions and get to things that you really want to know about.
So let's go back to that last slide for just a moment. Is there philosophically or commercially and maybe even immigration wise, is there a big difference between the two, or how big is the difference?
The difference is probably not as big as would have been the case between AMLO and either one of these. Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador is kind of a left-wing firebrand, used to be mayor of Mexico City, and has had a fairly aggressive attitude towards the U.S., which Claudia Sheinbaum does not share. Like she's more of a technocrat, more oriented towards economic growth as far as Mexico is concerned. Now she is more to the left than Xochitl Galvez would be. She's very interested in things like climate change. That's actually where her scientific background is. Both of them, however, are basically pro-business and pro-American in that sense, that they're trying to kind of keep spurring the development. Mexico is slated to grow next year by about 3.5%. They have never seen as much foreign direct investment as they have in the last year or two. And a lot of it has been coming from people who used to invest in China. China has seen a dramatic drop in FDI. They've seen foreign direct investment levels down to what they saw in the 90s. And a lot of that's now coming to Mexico because these companies are like, hey, we invested in China because it was a low-cost platform. Well, it isn't now. Mexico is. And when it comes to things like immigration, both of them are basically saying, look, the immigration problem you're dealing with is the same one we're dealing with. The people who are coming into your country aren't Mexicans. We've had never seen a smaller number of Mexican immigrants coming into the U.S. They're coming in from Central America. They're coming in from Venezuela. They come through Mexico. And the Mexicans are literally saying, we tried to stop them, but they're coming across the southern border, which is jungle. So we end up just driving them north and saying, look, we don't want you. We don't have jobs for you. You're not Mexican. You're Guatemalan. You're Nicaraguan. I work with the Border Patrol, and they said the Mexican army is trying to be helpful. They'll stay on the other side of the border and yell across with megaphones, they're from Guatemala, just a heads up. It's like, so you know where to send them later. They're not from here. And so both of these candidates are saying, yeah, we have a mutual problem. And the mutual problem is that Central America is a mess. Venezuela is even a bigger mess. And we've got 4 million people from Venezuela that have come across the border just to get away from the nut job Maduro. I mean, I was talking to a guy one time and I said, so where are you from? Venezuela. What are you doing here? Working illegally. How come? He says, I was an accountant in Caracas. I had my own business, but I made the mistake of calling Maduro a horse's ass in public, and I was put on a death list along with my family. I had 24 hours to get out of Venezuela. So I had a friend who had a client in the US, said, go to such and such, he'll take care of you. So yeah, I'm working in the US. If somebody would shoot that SOB, I'd go home.
You're gonna say,
So
and the 800,000 people in Guyana may be the ones who do it because they're
yeah, exactly. Because they're kind of like, this guy, it's one of, without getting into a whole geopolitical thing, the United States does not like to get itself involved in everybody's affairs. We've done that for decades. But this is what happens when you don't. We're the only player that really can. And when you don't stop somebody like Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro, they don't play nice. They're dictators. They're corrupted dictators. And eventually that problem lands in your lap, whether you want it to or not. And so, it's not pleasant to sit there and say, I don't want to be the world's policeman, but we know what happens when there aren't policemen. It's like the criminals kind of run rampant.
well. So we can go ahead and move off the screen here. But
Yes, exactly.
to your point, I had a question coming in. So here's I'm gonna read this to you as it came into me here, and then go from there. It is, Chris, are we now using the term discount rate and Fed funds rate interchangeably? I was taught the Federal Reserve set the discount rate at the discount window, and the Fed's fund rate is the rate banks charge each other for overnight and reserve shortages. Is there a goal of avoiding the discount window, or what's
Now, the discount window is basically derived from the Fed funds rate. The Fed funds rate is seen as kind of the the marker for everything else. Prime rate comes from that. Eventually, things like mortgage rates and car loan rates, it's sort of the bar that's set. And it is, as you described, it's the rate that banks charge each other for overnight loans. So it's the cheapest loan you can get because banks are just basically helping each other out, saying, hey, you loaned a lot of money. You don't have that money to loan. Don't worry about it. Just borrow from me so you can keep on growing, and off we go. But then everything else derives from that. So if the Fed funds rate goes up, then that's the cost of business for the bank. And so the bank ends up raising all of its rates, not necessarily in lockstep. And that's one of the things that your industry sees all the time. The banks have an option. They don't have to necessarily match what the Fed does. They eventually all do, just because it makes sense for them to do so. But for a period right after the Fed manipulates the Fed funds rate, you'll see variation in banks because the banks will say, look, I'm going to take advantage of this and keep my rates down a little bit for a little while so I can get some business, and
Mhm.
then I'll move them back up. And other banks will take a more conservative position. But it's the Fed's manipulation of the monetary system is always very indirect. It's kind of it's often been described as pulling or pushing a string. When they want to restrict the economy, it's really easy because you're pulling on the string.
Right?
But when you're trying to stimulate it, you're pushing the string. And we all know what happens when you push a string. It doesn't go where you want it to. And that's why the Fed always struggles when it's told, stimulate the economy. Well, okay. That's not as easy as it sounds. Restricting it is easy, particularly if you want to be Paul Volcker. And Volcker said, yeah, I'll pull the string, like you pull the leash on a mad dog. Yank it. And it's like, and now that the dog is screaming in agony, I've slowed the economy down. A little too much there, Paul, but
Mhm.
I get the gist.
So, a question for you. You may have touched on this in passing. This is one of the questions. Um, the delay in transition from credit card delinquencies to
Hmm.
the next steps. Is there a
Right.
Is there a standard expectation on something like that, or is it just all over the place?
There's not a standard expectation, partly because the consumer has been defying logic. I mean, right now, the consumer collectively owes $7 trillion in credit card debt, and they owe $20 trillion in regular debt. Most economists, if you'd asked them 10 years ago, what will consumers do when they're carrying that much debt? Oh my God, they'll panic and they'll start, well, we're carrying it, kind of going, yeah, I don't care. I'll pay my MasterCard with my Visa. I'm still good. And again, talking to the car dealers the other day, I said, okay, you've got very expensive cars. You've got people who are heavily in debt. How do you sell anything? And they said, you don't understand what happens when people come in to buy a car. They may be sitting on an enormous debt, but they look at that car and they may see a very expensive car and all they want to know, what's my monthly payment? And the guy said, remember when a 4 or 5 year car loan was considered long? He said,
Mhm.
I just did a car loan the other day, 12 years. I'm giving car loans that are as long as a mortgage. And he said, the person, like, you're getting a 12-year loan on a car? Yeah, I want to get the interest of monthly payments down. So we don't really know when that's going to be enough to break the consumer's back. In previous years, there would have been a sense that now would be the time that people would start really cutting back on their debt, and that you'd really start to see bankruptcy activity and delinquencies. Like the car dealers said, if this was 10 years ago, we would have had a lot of people in repossession land right now.
Right.
But because they got very, very low monthly payments, we're not doing a lot of repos. We're just looking at people who are on a perpetual cycle. They have these 12-year loans, 10-year loans, 8-year loans on a car, and they just keep trading it in and extending another loan. And so we've basically got customers now who have no expectation at all of ever paying off their car. They're gonna basically treat it the way they treat their mortgage.
Well, speaking of that, let me go from a real estate perspective. What's the anticipated effect of the student loan issue, student loan crisis, the non-payments? How does that going to affect real estate, do you think?
It hasn't had a big impact on single family real estate because most of the people that are in that student loan crisis environment tend to be younger, and they're not yet in that single family home market necessarily, particularly with Gen Z and millennials. Where you see the differentiation within student loans, and this has kind of gotten overlooked, I think, by the media. There's sort of three buckets of student loan, I guess, users. The upper group are the ones that went to school, got degrees that were targeted to making a living. They were the ones that used student loans to become lawyers and doctors and engineers and accountants and whatever. They're overwhelmingly not delinquent. And they went to school the way you're supposed to, get a good job, etc. Then you've got the bucket in the middle that was a little less focused, and you start to see some more student loan delinquency there because they got degrees that maybe weren't as sellable. The biggest problem is the bottom third because they either got absolutely useless degrees, which did not set them up to pay the loan, or they went to very poor schools. And what we have tended to overlook is that a lot of the student loan crisis was anchored in the proprietary schools, the ones that said, hey, enroll here or learn to be a cosmetologist or whatever. And they were scams. And these students are stuck paying these loans. Majority of the damage of the student loan problem has been in multifamily. It's been on the rental side, where they are suddenly unable, to pay rent. rents have gone up along with everything else, and if you're also paying on a student loan. And then the other question is how much of a student loan obligation are you dealing with? The issue, and we could go on about this forever, part of what created the problem in the first place was when student loans became a government thing instead of private. Back in the Stone Age, when I was getting student loans, it was through a bank. I never saw that money. It went straight to the school, paid for tuition. That was it. It was like I got not one glance at that money. Then it was taken over and became, here's your money, do whatever you want with it. You can pay tuition with it, you can pay your apartment with it, you can go on a beer bun with it, you can do whatever. It's your money. You decide what to do with it. And much of it was subsequently squandered. So, and it even became an issue because universities lost a lot of their state funding. And rather than cut services, they basically turn to tuition. And you can't turn to tuition if people can't pay it. So the student loan program expanded so people could pay tuition. So it's a problem that was developing 20, 30 years ago. And as is often the case, if the problem is, oh, we'll deal with that in 20, 30 years, hoping that it never comes. It's like, this is why every day I'm very glad that I'm 70. There are certain problems I will not have to deal with.
All right. So let me ask you this question. Considering the potential industrial expansion in Mexico, and I'm going to say this as both nearshoring and then the reshoring
Hmm.
impacts, what do you see on kind of regional commercial real estate?
Yeah, you're going to see a lot of development on the border, which is kind of obvious by all the transportation shifts. So you're seeing a lot of activity in Arizona, in Texas, Oklahoma even. And then you start looking at how the reshoring process is going, and it's following rail. It's following where they can get access to good rail service. They're also following where there's good worker availability. And that goes back to whether or not a state has invested in trade schools. So one of the things that's really been causing manufacturers to choose is looking at a state that is supporting community colleges and trade schools because they need a pipeline. So you start to see states that have taken that seriously and they're growing. One of the reasons you're seeing a lot of activity in places like Tennessee and Kentucky is that they have invested heavily in trade schools. You're seeing some of that even in Minnesota. We're seeing it in North Dakota. And so the manufacturer that is moving back from China is looking for access to transportation. They're looking for work, looking for a good tax environment, and that's drawing them into certain states. Much of what's going into Mexico is not coming from the US. For a while, we were concerned that we were losing manufacturing to Mexico. Now, what's obvious is that it's China that's losing manufacturing to Mexico. And so it's not that we're not gaining perhaps as much as we might, but you've got companies that are saying, look, I still need low labor costs and I still can't produce in the US. Labor costs are too high, but I can produce in Mexico. And when the UAW strike was going on, the very day that the UAW declared that they were going to go on strike, Mexico picked up 5 automotive operations investing in Mexico, saying, well, you just made producing in the US even more expensive than it was before. So what do you think we're going to do?
Mhm.
We're going to move someplace that's less expensive, i.e. Mexico.
Okay. So I'm going to share this out with everyone. This is a link to the intelligence services, one of the briefings that Chris provides. You'll see it on there, the flagship. Highly recommend this. I love it. It gives me just a little bit of a pulse of what's going on multiple times a week. and periodically there'll be something emergency that comes out. They'll give updates on other things as well. So put that up there while I ask this last question, kind of going into it. Chris, you'd mentioned about Generation Z staying home longer. How is that going to impact both kind of that next generation buying homes, as well as the baby boomers who would typically be kind of downsizing? And, what does that do? What's the impact of that? Is it a delay? Is it a denial?
Yeah, it's been very disruptive for the home real estate market, because the pattern that we had gotten so used to has been sort of shattered in the last couple of decades. You used to have parents that would reach a point where they would sort of hand their home off to their offspring. So the boomer, to a degree, well, now the next generation would be in that house. Well, the boomer now lives far longer. So when they get to the point that they're leaving their home, well, their children already have a home. And so they're not interested in the parents' home. And now you're turning to the grandkids. Are you interested? No, I'm not interested in that home either, because I'm living in a different part of the country or a city. When you are boomer generation, you're trying to figure out what you're going to do with that existing stock, which is losing value in certain areas depending on where it is. Because the second biggest driver of multifamily housing is the boomer now, because the boomer is moving from single family to assisted living, senior living. You just get to a point where I don't want to deal with this stuff. I'm going to move into something else. The Gen Z is much more rootless at this stage. They're kind of like, I don't know where I'm going to settle. I don't really want to buy a house and then get stuck with trying to sell it. So I'm going to stay in apartment living. Some of the trends that we're seeing with Gen Z, they're almost more like the Europeans. They want to live in a multifamily environment, in a city environment where there's lots of stuff to do around where they live, and they don't plan to spend all that much time in their home itself. And Gen Z is not anxious to start families. The number one thing that drove people to get a house was having kids. Raising children in an apartment complex is not fun. So what drove boomers and even Gen X was, hey, I've got children. I want to move to the suburbs. I want good schools. I want a yard, all that stuff. And Gen Z is like, yeah, well, I'm not going to have kids. They're supposed to bring you joy. When did I ever bring you joy? I don't want one of me. It's pain in the butt. That's what my kids are going to be. Nope. I have no families. This is bizarre, but you now seem to have like a designated parent. Like one of the brothers and sisters has kids, and everybody else just kind of borrows them, their nieces and nephews. That's fine. I had them for a weekend. Now go home.
So, all right. Speaking of nieces and nephews, I know you have a couple of fur babies, as it were.
Yes, yes.
Is that one of them on the screen there, or is that?
Well, that's a look that I frequently get, because when you have cats, you realize that there is no earthly reason to have doors, because every door that is shut is going to be confronted by the cat going, "Why is that shut?" "It's a closet. Don't worry about it." "Yes, but the door is shut. I can't get in there." "I know. That's intended." Um, so I frequently, yeah. One thing about having cats is you will never ever use the bathroom alone again.
Well, so as a parting shot on your way out, any closing statements? And one question for you on the way out is interest rates, where you see this going?
Yeah, my closing statement is that I think we are going to do better in 2024 than many were predicting. I think we're going to do reasonably well the first couple of, even though people who were predicting a recession. The bigger concern maybe at the end of the year, when we really start some of the debt situations. That said, I think the Fed will start to reduce interest rates. I don't think they're going to do it before summer. One of the things that they're going to wait to see is what happens with oil prices as we get into the driving season. And at the moment, we've been dodging the bullet on per barrel pricing. All kinds of stuff that should be making it more expensive hasn't been. So I think the Fed will probably wait till late second quarter, maybe even early third. But I think eventually they will take the rates down. Kind of a thing to watch from the standpoint of figuring out Fed policy is what the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada do, because we have been sort of following their lead in a couple of respects, particularly the Bank of Canada. They've been a lot more sensitive to commodity pricing, particularly oil, than we have traditionally. So I think it's going to be a halfway decent year. Like I said, big country, some parts will do better than others, but in general, I think we're probably looking at 2.5% growth on an annual basis.
Well, Chris, thank you very much again for fantastic insight. We look forward to having your articles ongoing and the different products we have and the different documents that go out. But I do want to
Very
say,
good.
just folks, if you get a chance to sign up for a flagship, you'll find it well worth your time. Chris, I cheat a little bit. I actually load it into a reader and have it read it to me
Excellent.
while I'm driving. So
Excellent. Excellent.
don't always get to see all the graphs and charts as much, but I get to hear it, and it's fantastic updates. So I just encourage everybody on that. And so thank you again, Chris.
And just reiterating what I say often is that if you have questions later or comments or just anything, that's my email. Just send me. I am just as long-winded in print as I am in public. So
All righty. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you next month.
thanks.